OpenAI just released the new ChatGPT API to the public, which means there's about to be an explosion in new software business opportunities. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to create your own backend server that connects to ChatGPT so that you can start creating your own ChatGPT software projects. And to make things easier for you, I've broken this video up into 3 separate parts. And the first part, we're going to cover why people are so excited about this API. The second part, we're going to cover how to use it. And in the third part, we're actually going to dive into the code and start building our own backend server. So feel free to skip around to whichever part of the video interests you the most. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. So here's why developers are so excited. On March 1st, OpenAI released the new ChatGPT and Whisper API. This means developers like you and I now have access to create our own products that are integrated with ChatGPT. And when you dig into the documentation, you can see that this new ChatGPT model only cost 1/10 the cost of their other models, which is just amazing. I know I've been doing over 100 requests this weekend and it's only cost me a dime, which means it's super affordable for developers like you and I to test out. OpenAI actually recommends using this model to experiment with before diving into any of their other models. Because the ChatGPT API is so powerful and affordable, it's no wonder why companies like Snapchat, Quizlet, and Instacart have already started to incorporate it into their own products. And what's also crazy is if you head over to Product Hunt, you can see that developers are releasing ChatGPT-based products in droves. So now that you've been caught up, let me show you how to actually use this new API. To get started using the ChatGPT API, the first thing you need to do is head over to this page, and I'll provide a link to it down in the description below. But once you get to this page, the first thing you're going to do is hit this chat button, and then you want to scroll down just to see a Python example. So like I said earlier, we're going to be doing everything in JavaScript, but they're still very similar. So let me break down what you're looking at. When using the ChatGPT API, you have to focus on providing 2 different things. First off, you have to specify the model. In this case, we're using the GPT 3.5 Turbo model, which is basically the ChatGPT model. And then after that, you have to pass in a series of messages. As you can see below, we're passing in models based on different roles and users. How I like to think about it is the first message, which is the role of a system, basically provides the context for the entire message. This is a great place for you to say, hey, you are a professional tweeter, or hey, you're a professional author, or you're a professional coder. Basically just to provide additional context to help steer the conversation. And then after that point, you start going back and forth where you as the user will pass in messages such as asking it questions, and then the model itself will respond as an assistant, and you can just go back and forth. So that's just the basics of how to interact with the ChatGPT API. So let's go ahead and grab our own access keys so we can start interacting with the model ourselves. And to grab our access keys, the first thing we're going to have to do is sign up for an OpenAI account if this is the first time you're using it. But if you already have an account like I do, I'm going to go ahead and log in real fast. Because I've actively been using this API, you'll see that it automatically brings me to the usage screen where I can see my total bill for the past month. If this is your first time logging into OpenAI, you won't be able to see this. What you'll probably be brought to is the billing section where it will ask you to enter in your credit card information. And don't worry, it's not going to cost an arm and a leg. I've been doing hundreds of requests, and as you can see, I have a grand whopping total of 53 cents that I owed to ChatGPT. But now here comes the important part for developers. In order for us to grab our API keys, we need to click this API keys tab on the left-hand side, and this will bring us to a page to show us all of our active API keys. Now, since this is the first time you're using it, your screen might not look like this. As you can see, I already have an active secret key because I've been working with the API. But to create your new secret key, what you need to do is click this button right here. Now, this will generate a new API key for you that you're going to use in all of your applications. So you're going to want to hit this copy button right here and save it somewhere safe. It's important that you don't save this to your GitHub repo or somewhere public, because if someone has access to this secret key, they'll be able to charge to your account. But now that I got that out of the way, let's go ahead and head over to Postman, which is a tool for making API requests, so we can start experimenting with this new API. So I've just pulled up Postman so we can start experimenting around and sending our own requests to the ChatGPT API. And in case this is the first time you've been using this tool, I've added a link down to Postman in the description below so you can download it and install it on your own computer. All right, so now onto the fun stuff. In order for us to send our first API request over to ChatGPT, there's a few things that we need to do. First off, we need to create a new request. So in our case, I'm just going to come over here and say add a request. And this will open up a window that will allow us to send and type in the properties of the message that we'd like to send over to our API. And as good developers, we know all the answers are usually in the documentation somewhere. So let's head back over to OpenAI and look at their documentation. And let's scroll down to the chat section because we're working with the ChatGPT models. And if you scroll down, you can start to see over here on the right-hand side, they have a few example requests for us that show how we need to send our messages over. So let me break this down real fast. What's going on? So up top, they have a URL that says where we need to send our request to. This is our endpoint. Next, it tells us what kind of content we're sending. So in our case, we're sending a JSON object. Then we're going to pass in our bearer token. This is basically the secret key that we copied from earlier. And lastly, this -d parameter specifies the JSON object that we're going to send. So let's go ahead and recreate the same thing over in Postman, and I think it'll be a lot more clear. To make things as easy as possible, I've pulled up an example request from the documentation on the left, and now we're going to start populating it in Postman on the right. So first thing we're going to want to do is change our endpoint to match this ChatGPT URL right here. And then we want to change from a GET request to a POST request so we can start sending data along. More specifically, we want to be sending JSON data. So we need to go to the body. We want to be sending over raw JSON objects. Great. Next, we need to update our authorization to use our bearer token. So if we click authorization, we can change the type to be a bearer token. And then my security key has already been pasted in here. However, you'll probably want to go ahead and paste in your security key. And then lastly, we want to paste this JSON object over to our code. So what we need to do is go back to body to paste in our JSON object. And then just as a recap, the model right here allows us to use the ChatGPT model, and then we start to pass along our messages. So I'm going to go ahead and send this request so we can see what happens. Okay, so this is pretty cool. You can see that we sent a hello message to the ChatGPT endpoint, and you can see that it responded there with a hi there, how can I assist you today? Since you now know how to send a request to the ChatGPT API, let me show you two more advanced options so you can see what this API is really capable of. In this intermediate request, you can see we're going a little bit deeper. This time we're passing some additional context where we say, hey system, you are a YouTube title generating machine. And then we pass along the rest of our conversation. In this case, our user goes, I'm creating a new YouTube video that teaches people how to use ChatGPT API with JavaScript. Please generate 5 YouTube titles. So let's go ahead and send this request off real fast and see what we get back. So we just got back a response from ChatGPT, and you can see that these YouTube titles actually turned out pretty good, but they're a little too long. So I want to walk you over to the advanced option real fast so you can see how we can improve our ChatGPT responses. In this advanced option, you can see we're providing a lot more context to the system so it properly knows how to respond to our user request. So let's go ahead and send off this request and see what options we get back. So ChatGPT just got back with these updated titles, and I think these are leaps and bounds better than the previous responses. But what's great about ChatGPT is that we can actually respond to previous messages in a conversation-like manner. So if we actually scroll down to the back to our request, we can paste in our response from our assistant, and then after that, we can actually paste in an updated response and go, hey ChatGPT, I would like you, let me go ahead and beautify it real fast. We can say, I would like you to create 5 more titles like number 1. So please create 5 more titles like option number 1. And this is very similar to what you would experience in the web browser where ChatGPT would send you an answer and then you would type back, hey, I don't like that, do something else. So let's go ahead and send out this request and see what we get back. So ChatGPT just got back to us and you can see it's following along with our conversation. Here are 5 more titles just like option number 1, and then it did generate 5 more titles like number 1. So great. Now that you're a pro at sending off individual requests to ChatGPT, what we're going to do next is build our server to handle sending requests on our behalf. So let's hop over to our code editor and start coding. All right, now comes the fun stuff where we're going to start coding up our backend. And I'm going to walk you through this process step by step. But don't worry, if you get lost or confused at any points, drop a comment down below or shoot me a DM on Twitter and I'd be happy to help. All right, let's get to building. So the first thing we need to do is make a folder for our new project. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then we need to change directory into our new folder path. And then from there, what we're going to do is initialize a new project. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And then this will create our new project directory. So if I do ls, you can now see we have a package.json file. Now comes the fun part where we're actually going to open up our code editor, in this case Visual Studio Code, and we're going to start building our project out. As you can see right now, this is a completely empty project, so we need to start adding some stuff. So the first thing that I'm going to add is an index.js file, so we can actually look like we have some JavaScript going on. And then after that, what we're going to do is install our dependencies. And in the case of our project, we're going to need to install 5 different dependencies. Let me show them you real fast. The first one we're going to need to install is called Axios, and this is going to help make our lives easier when we start making requests to the ChatGPT Backend API. Next, we're going to install Body Parser, which is basically some middleware to help us transform things to JavaScript objects. .env is going to allow us to save our environment variables in a separate file so we don't have to store our secret keys in our GitHub code. Next, we're going to use Express to help route all of our different endpoints. And lastly, we're going to use yup for some validation. And now when we hit each one of these dependencies in our code, I'll walk through them in more detail so it'll make more sense. So we're going to go ahead and install those real fast. And this might take a few seconds. But once they finish installing, you'll see that it updates our package.json. All right, great. Now let's head back over to our index.js file and start writing some JavaScript. The first thing that we're going to need to do to create our backend Express server is actually import the Express library. Once we import the Express library, we're going to create our own instance of the Express application. And after that, we're going to import our body parser middleware. This is basically going to turn everything into JSON objects to make it more accessible for us. And now that we've imported that middleware, we actually need to set up our Express application to use this body parser. Now we haven't created these files yet, but we will in just a moment. But the next thing we're going to do is say, hey, I want you to import this ChatGPT module. And what I want you to do with it is to route all traffic that hits our Express backend server on this specific endpoint. So let's just say localhost /ChatGPT. I want you to route all traffic that hits this endpoint to this route module right here. And like I said, we haven't built these files yet, but we will in just a minute. I think it's just helpful to see this Express app in its entirety before we start actually building out some of the backend code. So what we're going to do next is actually set up some error handling. This is basically just going to say, hey, anytime we hit an error, I just want to log it and return with a status code of 500 saying that an internal server error happened. And then finally, what we're going to do is actually start our server to listen on port 3000. And before we continue developing, what I'm going to do real fast is actually comment out this endpoint right here and create a dummy endpoint so we can see that our Express server is actually working. So I'm just going to say app.post, just all root traffic. I want to go to the, let's just make a dummy function real fast just to return a hello. So res.status 200, a 200 status code means everything that works. And then we're just going to send a message of hello. Great, so now if we run our node server saying node.index.js, what we'll do is it'll say our server is started on port 3000. So what we're going to do real fast to test it out is head back over to Postman and then send a post request to localhost 3000 real fast. Localhost 3000 / and we said we're going to do a post request. So if I send it, you'll see that we'll get back a message that says hello. So everything's working. So now let's move on to actually start hooking things up to work with ChatGPT. So I'm going to close this out real fast, uncomment our code, get rid of this dummy endpoint, zoom in to make it easier for you guys to see. And now let's go ahead and start building our next file. So the first thing that we should do is go ahead and start creating this route right here so everything will start working. So what we're going to do first is create a new folder called routes. And then within that routes, we're going to create a file called ChatGPT. So let's go ahead and do that real fast. ChatGPT.js. So before we start coding, the important thing to remember about this file is its whole purpose is to redirect all requests that come to the /ChatGPT endpoint, do some additional formatting, send this information off to the cloud, and then receive the response when it comes back. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is once again import our Express library. And instead of creating a brand new application this time, what we want to do is create a new router instance instead. This is because if you go back to our index.js file, what we're doing is using the app use endpoint, which basically makes all our traffic get directed to a specific route. So that's why we're creating a router instance over here. And next, to make your life easier, what I've done is I've created a new post request and I filled it in with to-dos that we need to accomplish. So let's just walk through them real fast. And to start, let's keep everything high level and we'll dive down into detail when we actually start coding things out. But just as a high level, what we're going to do is receive messages that include what the user's asking us. We need to do some formatting. Then we're going to send off those messages to the ChatGPT API endpoint. Then we're going to get back a response. It might have an error. If it does, we're going to handle it. If not, what we need to do from that point forward is do some additional formatting and then send that response back to our user. So that's what we're going to be doing. And then finally, what we need to do is export this entire module. All right, great. So now let's dive into coding each one of these to-dos so it all makes sense. So the first function that we're going to start working on is validating this request body. And to keep our code clean, what I'm going to do is create a new folder called utils. And then inside utils, what I'm going to do is create a new file called ChatGPT util.js. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and back over here and paste in a stub of code. And let me just explain what's going on real fast. So what we want to do is say, hey, was the request that was sent to us a valid request? If it wasn't, what I want to do is respond with a status of 400 saying, hey, you the user sent something wrong, and I want to let them know in the response that we send back. Okay, great. So now let's go ahead and make this function over here in our ChatGPT util file. So let me walk you through what's going on. So the first thing that we're going to do is, like I said earlier, we want to be validating information that's sent to us. So we're going to be using the yup library, which is basically used for creating schemas and validating schemas. So that's what's going on right here. Next, what we're going to do is create our specific schema for the request that's going to be sent to us. In our case, there's going to be 3 specific pieces of information that are going to be sent to us: a context, a message, and a conversation. The context, once again, is going to be the piece of information that says, hey, system, you need to be acting in this way. The message is going to be the last piece of information that we receive from the user, such as generate 10 titles or something like that. And finally, there's going to be the conversation, which summarizes everything that's happened up to this point. So just imagine like you and I were having a conversation. You could say, hey, Brennan, I need help with a book. I need you to make me 10 titles. I could give you 10 titles. And then your latest message, you would go, oh, I really like option number 3. make me 3 more of those. So that's kind of how the conversation piece works. And as you can see, the context and message are required for each request that comes to us. However, a conversation is not required, because you have to imagine the first time a user sends up a message to us, there is no conversation. It's the beginning of one. All right, so I hope that makes sense for yup and schema validation. So let's dive back to our original function. So what we're doing, once again, is just passing in the request. We're going to run the validate sync function on the request that gets passed in, so we can validate the context message and conversation that get passed in. We're going to return true if it was a valid schema and return false if it wasn't. And right out the gate, you might notice that this is valid request is grayed out because it's not being used. How we're going to fix that is using the module.exports function down here at the bottom, and we're going to pass in our isValidRequest. All right, great. Now we're exporting this function so we can actually use it back over in our ChatGPT. So what we can do over here is we can import it. Let's see if we can use a shortcut real fast. What I did on my Mac was hit Control and Spacebar. If you're on Windows, you can hit Command and Spacebar, and it will generate a helpful hint to make your life easier and import this for you. So I'm going to click it. And as you can see now that we have imported our new util function up here at the top of the file. All right, great. So let's keep going with the rest of these functions. And as you can see, the next thing that we want to do is extract the message and conversation from the request body. So what we're going to do is some destructuring where we pull out the message, context, and conversation from this object. And you can see that we're adding a default value for the conversation. Next, what we're going to do is actually create the context message. And to create this context message, what I'm going to do is paste in this code right here, where we create a new message where we pass in the context. And you'll also notice that we're passing in this user type right here. This user type basically can either be a system, a user, or an assistant. This is basically going to help us organize our messages later. So let's hop over to our util file real fast and paste in the code to create our message. As you can see, this is super simple. We're just passing in the message and the role. We're making it generic on purpose just because there are 3 different roles that can happen. So if we hop back over to our code, the next function that we're going to work on is adding our user message to the conversation. And to do that, what we're going to do is create another new function called add message to conversation. So let's head back over to ChatGPT util file real fast and show me what this is going to do. So what you can see is in this new function, what we're going to do is create a new message using our old function. And this is in this function, what we're going to do is once again pass in our message and our role. And what we're going to do after that is append our new message to the conversation. So if you head back, and if you remember earlier, our conversation is just an empty array. So this is starting to build up a conversation array. Great, we're halfway there, and we'll start logging stuff in a little bit so you can see what's actually happening. But the very next thing that we're going to do is start calling the ChatGPT API endpoint. And this is the most important part of the whole file, so let me walk you through each part very carefully. So what we're going to do on our router side is just send a request to post our ChatGPT conversation that we've built up this far. And then if you go back over here, let's walk through everything step by step. So the first thing we want to do is import our new packages. In this case, that means importing the .env file, which will allow us to access our API keys. And then we're also going to import the Axios library so we can start making requests to the ChatGPT API. Next, we're going to set up some constants to where we can actually point to the ChatGPT endpoint and specify the specific model that we want to use. After that, what we're going to do is set up our configuration headers for our Axios request to incorporate our ChatGPT API keys. And after that, what we're going to do is build up our conversation. So what that means is we're going to add our context message, and then we're going to append the rest of the message to build one long array of messages. And then after that, what we're going to do is actually create our post ChatGPT message that you saw back over here in our router file. So let me walk you through it real fast. So let's go part by part. So the first thing that we're going to do is build up our conversation, which we just described a second ago. And if you hop back over to Postman, when I say the word conversation, basically what I mean is this messages array right here, where you can see we set the context for the system, and then we start to go back and forth through the user asks questions and then the assistant responds. So that's what I mean when I say conversation. And as you can see in this ChatGPT data model that we're creating, it has the model and messages key, just like we had earlier in our object that we were sending up using Postman. And now comes the fun part where we actually start sending off our messages using Axios. So as you can see with Axios, we can say, hey, I would like you to create a post request. I would like you to send this post request to a specific endpoint with this specific data and using this specific configuration that we made up here earlier. What we're going to do then is await it, because we're going to call this function asynchronously, and we're going to get back a response. This response has data tied to it, and this data is formatted in a specific format. And if we go back to the ChatGPT API documentation, we can see this is the exact response format we can expect to see. So if we scroll down here, we can see that if we want to grab the context of the message that the system sends back to us, we need to grab the choices array. We need to grab the first element. That's why there's a 0 here. And then within inside of this object, we need to grab the message key. And then within this message key, we need to grab the content. And if you look, these role and content formats look very familiar to the create message function that we made on our side earlier. So if we go back over to our code, you can see that we're doing the exact same thing. We're grabbing the data. Inside the data, we're grabbing the first element from the choices array, and then we're grabbing the message. And if everything works as expected, what we're going to do is just return the message so we can continue back with our function over here. But if something goes wrong, we have a catch statement where we're going to return null, and we're also going to log the error. So I hope all that made sense. Feel free to ask questions down in the comments below, or like I said, shoot me a message on Twitter. I'd be happy to help. But let's keep chugging along. So what you can see, the next thing that we're going to work on is checking to see if there's an error with the ChatGPT API. And what we're going to do in this case is look at the response that we got back, and in case that we got a null, just in case you remember, we return null if something goes wrong. We check for a null, and if we do get a null, what we're going to do is send back a status code of 500, which means something went wrong with the server. Like I said earlier, a 400 means something went wrong with you, a 500 means something went wrong with us. And I'm also going to pass along the error response saying that there was something wrong with ChatGPT. But if everything that was working properly, we'll head down here, and what we're going to do is pull out the content from the ChatGPT response. Now this part's pretty straightforward, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste it. So once again, we're going to destructure the response. In this case, we're going to pull out the content. And if you head back, if you remember what a typical message looks like, it has a, oh, let me find it for a second. A typical message has a role and content. So that's how we were able to pull out our content. And the next step that we're going to do is add the response that we got back from ChatGPT. We're going to add it to the end of the conversation, and we're also going to specify the type to be assistant because that's who the response came from. Assistance equals ChatGPT. And if you remember from earlier, we already have an add message to conversation function that we created earlier inside of our util library. So the very final step that we have to do for our main function is to add in this code where we send back the response to our user. In this case, everything worked properly, so we're going to send back a 200 status code, which means everything worked. And then finally what we're going to do is send back an object where we have the conversation. And now that we wrap that up, we actually need to do some general house cleaning in this function, such as going back to our ChatGPT util file and exporting some of the functions that we just created. So I'm going to do that real fast. Pretty much anyone that has been gray, we actually need to export down here at the bottom. And then let's go back up. Was there any other ones? Nope, that looks like we're exporting all the proper functions. So what I'm going to do real fast is head back over to our index file. I'm going to respin up the server so we can start trying this back out. And just like before, all we need to do is run our node.indexSet file. And oops, you can see we're already getting an error, so this is a great way to go ahead and see how to begin doing some debugging. So one of the first things that you can see is that we were actually supposed to do some additional validation for a conversation schema, which we did not create. So let's head back over to our ChatGPT util file and add this schema in real fast. We can see that the error we were getting was on line 46, so I'm going to quickly just go to line 46, and you can see that we needed to add our schema right here. So what I'm going to do is come over here and add in our new schema file. And I'm going to do that by pasting in this schema right here. As you can see, it's super similar to the request schema, except this time we're only going to accept the role and content type, which is actually what needs to be passed to every single message that gets sent up to the ChatGPT API. All right, great. So let's go ahead and save this and try and rerun our server. And it looks like everything spun up successfully, so let's head back over to Postman real fast. So I went ahead and did the due diligence of adding a message body that we can actually send up, and I've also updated the URL to point to our local host on the specific port and on our endpoint. So if I send this request, we should get back a response that will let us know if it worked properly. But I think I realized the error. We actually forgot to do something. So if we head back to our log real fast, we'll see that an error had occurred, and more specifically, it's because we did not define the create message function. So I'm going to close it at this real fast, and if we scroll up, you can see that we're calling the create message function, but we never imported it up on top. So what we need to do is go back and do our create message function right here, and we also need to add in our post change ChatGPT message as well. And then we need to add in the add message conversation as well, just because we call it in a few places like here and down below, but we've never imported. And the last import error that we need to fix is that I call out the user types function a few different times, but we never create it. So what we need to do is create a new folder to house our user types. So what I'm going to do is go over here and create a new folder for our constants. Inside of that constants, I'm going to make a new file called our ChatGPT roles.js file. I'm going to paste in this code where we define our different user types. In this case, we're going to have our user, assistant, and system, and specify the values for each one of these keys. I'm going to hop back over to our routes real fast, and then I'm going to import this new object. By doing that, I'm going to go ahead and save our file. And the last final major file that we have to add is our environment variable file, where we're actually going to store our API secret key. So I'm going to go ahead and paste mine in. Remember, you do not want to add this to your Git repo. So let me show you how to not do that real fast. You're going to create a git ignore file, and then you're going to say .env. This will make it whenever you initialize your Git repo. I'll just show you how to do that real fast too. Git init. Whenever you do this, you'll see that our .env file is added out. I'll also go ahead and ignore all of our node modules files. So you can see that this will hop down to 7. We've made 7 changes. And now what we can do is actually come back down here and rerun our server by running node.index.js. And if we head back over to Postman, is send our updated request. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real fast. You can see we're sending a request, and hopefully we should get something back from ChatGPT soon. All right, so it officially worked. You can see that in our message, we said, "You are Mr. Beast, and I would like to create 10 more titles." And the message responded to us with, as the assistant, saying, "Sure, here are 10 potential video titles, each 52 characters long." And then it made 10 awesome YouTube titles for us. Now let me show you the cool part. If we actually come back in here and copy this message, what we can do, let me shrink this for you real fast, is add our conversation, paste that in, save it, and then I can say, I would like 10 more titles just like option 5 down here. So what I can do is come back up to our latest message and say, I'd like to create 10 more titles like option 5. So if I save this and resend the response, what I would expect to get back is an updated conversation and 10 more titles just like option number 5. But we just got our answers back. So you can see at the end of our conversation, it appended our new message where we said we want 5 more options like number 5. And then it responded to that by creating 10 more options just like number 5. Yeah, so that's awesome. Our server is working just as expected. So yeah, let's recap what we've done. So far, you've learned how to spin up a backend server using Node and Express. You've learned how to communicate with the OpenAI API, and you've learned how to send messages back and forth. And lastly, you've learned how to test the backend server that you just created using Postman. So congratulations, you're basically a professional backend developer, and you also know how to use the most powerful tool on the internet right now, ChatGPT. And that's a wrap for this tutorial, but don't worry, I have a bunch of other great videos out there as well. I have one where I teach you how to create a landing page using ChatGPT and Midjourney. I also have another tutorial out there where I teach you how to create a children's book using the same tools. So be sure to check those out if you're interested in this content, and I'll hope to see you around in the next one. See ya.